Okay. All right, I think it's almost 3:10, so we'll go ahead and get started. You shouldn't be hearing this, but the folks online can hear. So we have a few people on Zoom, and hopefully they can hear. Type something in the chat box if you can't hear. Also, you can type in questions there, and at the end we can pass those on to Dr. Pete Nowak. So I want to thank everybody for coming out on kind of a slushy day to walk across campus. Some folks from the whole other side of campus. So thanks for coming. This is part of our kind of starting a new seminar series for the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. And some of our presentations this semester are looking back a little bit at some of the things that have happened, nutrient reduction and water quality monitoring, because I think it's important for us to kind of look back as we look forward as well. So if you have suggestions for future speakers into next semester, the plan is, if there's interest, to keep this going once a month. So let us know. We've already gotten 3 suggestions for next semester already, which makes our job easier. And so I want to introduce folks from the Iowa Nutrient Research Center. Ann Robinson, our communications specialist, Dr. Kay Stefanik, the Assistant Director of the Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and Malcolm Robertson, the Program Coordinator. So they're the ones that make anything happen. So it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Pete Nowak, Emeritus Professor from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, from the Gaylord Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies. Pete has worked on a number of issues, including the Wisconsin Buffer Initiative, which I think is relevant with some of the discussions that are going on in the state, working on adaptive management, and then kind of precision conservation, or can we do things on small parcels of land that can have a big impact on water quality. So thanks a lot, Pete, for making the journey down, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. You can see this is a title of a presentation that you usually don't see in academia. But I've been retired from academia now for about 10 years. I then went into agricultural consulting, had an agribusiness, and worked quite a bit with a number of the agrochemical companies for about 4 years, until I got tired of all the travel involved with that and the presentations, among others. And so for about the last 4 or 5 years, I found a great job. I'm working with the South Central Library System. I get to sort and deliver books all over Dane County, and I've got a reading stack that high, and it never gets smaller. It always continues to get bigger. What I'm going to do today is kind of offer some reflections of the 30-some years I spent working in resource conservation. And it all started here at Iowa State. I was a young assistant professor, full of book knowledge, statistical techniques, and not knowing much about agriculture when I came here in '78. I quickly learned a lot real quick, and I'll explain why in the presentation. But let me outline briefly where I want to go today. I'm going to have 2 themes. First, what a lot of you are concerned with, the science of resource management versus the policy of resource management, are very different. and they're divorced from each other, and rarely have they come together to work in some sort of synchronized fashion. The second theme that you're going to see is one that I really came upon in about the last 10 years of my research career. And I put that rather catchy title up there because I think it's really important if you're talking about nutrient management to recognize that indeed the tail does wag the dog. Let me start with that first theme. We'll get it up here in a second. There we go, 2 themes. The science of resource conservation. As you can see here, I've got 2 arrows going in opposite direction. I think it's clear that science has the capability of solving a lot of our resource problems, but often does not. And I'll give you some explanations on why not. And policy, which specifies programs, which are managed with the goal of solving resource management problems, does not. As I say, I've been working in this area for about 35 years, and I've seen a lot of different conservation policies and programs come and go, and a lot of the problems that I saw 35 years ago are still out there. So we have not solved those problems. And hopefully, some of the insights that will come from this seminar series will allow you, especially the young scientists here in the group, the graduate students, and that, give you a handle on how you can move forward on that. Why the disconnect? Well, first, you're going to quickly realize that conservation, when you talk about resource management or conservation, it's a very big tent. When I first started, just the first term up there was really what it was all about, soil erosion. That's where Hugh Hem Bennett and a number of others cut their teeth on, was the erosion issue because of the belief of soil productivity loss. It wasn't until we got into the 70s that we begin to see these other themes really emerge in terms of water quality issues. What happens when that soil runs off the field and into the streams? What happens to the aquatic ecosystems that are there? What happens to the infrastructure, dams, impoundments, when that soil runs off? And suddenly it began to bloom. And you see a lot of different things up there. I notice I even put water quality down twice. It must be really important. Farmland preservation, number of others. And the most recent one is, I've got listed there, is the biophysical shocks. Climate change is now a buzzword that you see in a lot of the resource management literature, where you get the extreme or episodic events that are causing undue damages in very specific locales. And last but not least is nutrient management. I keep hitting that one button. There we go. Here's the prototypical conservation program. I mean, we can go back to ACP, the Agricultural Conservation Program that the then Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service managed, and move right on up through a whole list of conservation programs. That program is created and imposed. It's created often at the federal or state, sometimes even local areas, and then it's imposed on that area, whether it's a state, whether it's a watershed, whether it's some other unit. It's a geographical unit, and that geography is identified in the program. The task then shifts to what I call information dissemination. The charge is to professional communicators to go out there and use communication to persuade farmers to join this program, to participate in this program. And they're supposed to come into the agency office to find out if they're eligible. If they're eligible, practices are installed, and they receive cost sharing. And if you look at the right-hand side of that slide, what that's resulted in is this helter-skelter approach where you get practices disseminated across the landscape in no rational pattern. And that's going to be one of the points I'm going to come back to. There has to be some rationality, what science has to offer in how we put our conservation practices where on the landscape. The prime principle of these conservation programs is do not cause discontent. You don't want anyone to be unhappy. One of the big programs back in '85, that shows you how it dates me, back in 1985, Pete Myers, who was then chief of the Soil Conservation Service, now the NRCS, decided that he was going to take what funds he had available and target those counties that had the highest erosion rates in the state, in the country, excuse me, in the country. And what that meant was that they were pulling staff out of some offices, like along the East Coast, and put him in offices here in the Midwest and elsewhere. For example, South Central Iowa, North Central Missouri, the Los Hills, in Western Iowa, you go out to the Palouse region, there are areas like that that were targeted. They received additional personnel. It was very controversial. The counterpart of your commissioners, district directors, or whatever they were called, had a heyday with that. The annual associations of those meetings were hanging Pete Myers in efficacy because he was taking resources out of their county where they should have a fair share, even though they didn't have any problems. And he was trying to target it on the areas. So the prime principle, do not cause discontent, really guided a lot of our early conservation efforts. So science and policy. And I think this first bullet up there is really important. And I'm paraphrasing my former colleague, Fran Pierce, who used that to describe precision ag. You're not going to get the right policy to come along at the right time in the right format. If that's what you're waiting to solve the nutrient management problems here in Iowa, you're going to be waiting even longer than I have. It's not going to happen. Policy alone is not going to solve your problems that you have to deal with. There's a role for science in here. And if you're interested, science cannot retreat to the ivory tower. A fun thing to do is go out on the internet and look up ivory tower and tell me how many professors engage in ivory tower academics. There's a tradition at Madison, UW-Madison, called the Wisconsin idea. And that idea is simply that the boundaries of the university is the boundaries of the state. As a faculty member at Madison, I had a responsibility to meet the needs of the citizens of the state. Now, I know that's not here in Iowa, but I also know that you have things called the Hatch Act and the Morrell Act that funds a lot of research here. Do you know, if you go back and read the original Hatch Act, you're going to find out that you have a moral and legal obligation, moral, thou shalt, moral and legal obligation to assist the citizens of the state. So ivory tower academics is not going to solve the issue. Oh, science's role. Risk is involved. You can either keep everyone happy or solve problems, but you're not going to do both. I guarantee. I could show you some of the scars I've got from this situation right here. You're going to make people mad if you go out there and try and solve problems using the best available science. I guarantee it. Because they like the status quo. They like the way things are. And as a scientist, you're challenging that. That is the role of science, as you'll see here in a second. Policymakers want effective and efficient programs. Effective in the sense that you're going to achieve a goal, and efficiency in terms of the unit cost per gain toward that goal. So they want you both to solve the problem, but do it in an efficient manner. So talk about impossible, but it's there. Interdisciplinary approach is essential. You build on disciplinary foundations, but you listen with an open mind. And up there, I think I've got, hierarchy of sciences. One of the things you as graduate students, and a number of graduate students here in the audience are going to learn, is there's an informal hierarchy of sciences. When I first came on this campus as that young assistant professor of rural sociology, Howard Johnson, Jim Baker, John Pesek, Min Amamiya, and others were involved in something called the 4 Mile Creek Watershed Project, a big project from the EPA. They had this very elaborate plan out where they're going to go into the 4 Mile Creek watershed, and each sub-watershed they were going to use different practices, terraces here, conservation tillage here, contouring here, and they were going to monitor the output of each sub-watershed. And then it dawned on them, what happens if the farmers don't want to adopt those practices? We better get a sociologist on board. So when I came down here, and this decision was made after I'd recruited and accepted the position, when I showed up, the dean and my department chair informed me that I will be part of the 4 Mile Creek project. I quickly learned that communication occurs downward. But if you want to communicate up that hierarchy, you have to learn their language. You have to learn their concepts. You have to learn what are some of the scientific laws and techniques that they're using. So that's a good lesson for the graduate students here. You have, if you want to communicate with a geneticist, for example, and they're up higher now than what they used to be, but they're up higher now. You're going to have to learn some of the terms and concepts to deal with them because they're not going to learn yours. You have to learn up. So that hierarchy of sciences. And the goal, as I point out here, is not more peer-reviewed publications. That doesn't mean you can't do peer-reviewed publications. That's an expectation if you're going to be in academia or even a lot of private sector venues. The expectation is you're going to publish what you're doing. But what I really want the scientists to think about is novel, innovative, creative paths to solving your nutrient management problems. Let me give you an example. And here's where I'm going to talk about something called the Wisconsin Buffer Initiative. In Wisconsin, this is a number of years ago now, we had a number of the environmental groups that got together and said, we want mandatory 30-foot buffers on all the riparian rivers and streams in the state of Wisconsin. Agriculture went through the roof when they began to recognize the amount of acreage that would be taken out of production. And so we had this controversy going back and forth in terms of we have to protect our waters, we have to protect our agriculture. Both of them are right. And they're going at each other and they're fighting constantly. I went to a colleague of mine, the environmental officer in the Wisconsin Farm Bureau, and said, look, go to the legislature and tell the legislature to ask the dean of my college, what's the best available science relative to riparian buffers? About 2 weeks later, the dean calls me down to the office and said, I've got this request from the legislature, what's the best available science relative to riparian buffers, and I want you to chair a committee to figure that out. So now I was in charge of a committee. I made some contacts and I got our national senator, Senator Cole at that time, to get some pork barrel, $500,000, to explore what's the best available science relative to riparian buffers. Then I brought them all to the table. As a matter of fact, it was a room much like this, except we had the tables in a U-shaped, where they were sitting facing each other. And of course, all the ag groups sat on one side, all the environmental groups sat on the other, and the agencies kind of hid in the corners because they didn't want to get caught in the stones that were going back and forth. You could see there's quite a diverse group up here. Everything from some of the big groups in our state, the Farm Bureau, but also Wisconsin corn growers. If you're talking about dairy, the PDPW, Professional Dairy Producers of Wisconsin, they are the cream of the cream in terms of very innovative, creative dairy farmers. We had the counterpart of your district employees, that's the Wisconsin Land Water employees. In Wisconsin, remember, our local, what you would call districts, a lot of the staff there are funded by the state. So there's something like 3 or 4 to 1 funded by the state versus what the NRCS would fund. So we had them, and then the state association, the agencies, DNR, DATCAP, USDA, the FSA, and of course the USGS, all sat at the table. Once the word got out in the college that I had $500,000, I had no problem at all getting the academics at the table. So I had, besides ag engineers, I had several ag engineers, I had agronomists, I had hydrologists, I had limnologists. These aren't from the College of Ag, they're from Letters and Sciences. The limnologists and the hydrologists came in, and we had a number of scientists there. And the way I structured it, because remember, there's a lot of rock throwing going on initially. I said, what questions do you want answered surrounding that prime cause? You know, what's the best available science? What questions do you want answered? Farmers had some questions. Environmental group had some questions. Back and forth. For about 3 months, we went back and forth, and we began to get questions. And then at that point, I brought the academics in and said, I want you to begin to address some of these questions. Here's some reoccurring themes, the questions that they want answered. And so they begin to address those questions. And these are some of the things that emerged after the end of the first year. Long-term performance of riparian buffers is being questioned. This is the time when we're beginning to see more episodic rain events. And the argument is if you get this riparian buffer down here and you got P coming down, both soluble and particulate P coming down, it's building up in that buffer. If we get a dramatic event, rain, and it breaches that buffer, it's going to take an awful lot of phosphorus into that stream. And so the whole idea of using the buffer as your only defense on stream water quality was thrown out. Both the Aggies and the environmental groups agreed that that was not the way forward. The second one, we begin to recognize that you can't expect the buffer, unless you want to have it 70, 80 feet wide in some spots, to really control the kind of runoff that was occurring. What we have to do is use more of a systems perspective and go up into the contributing area and look at what's happening in the contributing area relative to the buffer that's in place. And so we reframed that organizing question. And again, this is something there was consensus on. Where is the greatest probability of getting a meaningful water quality response to the implementation of conservation systems and riparian buffers? So we've shifted the question now to much more of a holistic type of perspective. The next thing we begin to deal with was the watershed size. On the left there, you see, if I remember rightly, I think that's an USGS 8-digit HUC, hydrologic unit classification. It's fairly big, and we threw that out. It was too big. The middle one is what our Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources did. Again, if you look at the average size of that, 167 square miles per watershed, we agreed it was too big. So we decided to create our own hydrologic units, and we had some of those scientists using the latest DEMs begin to create hydrologically complete. In other words, it was tied together, and we ended up creating 1,598 watershed units in the state of Wisconsin. And there's our goals again, and the idea was to rank each of those 1,598 if you put those conservation systems and riparian buffers in place, to what extent it's going to improve stream water quality, sustain that aquatic biotic diversity, and sustain lake water quality. Remember, a lot of our rivers and streams in Wisconsin run into lakes or reservoirs, impoundments, those type of things. So lakes came into it as well. Here's where we made a value decision. It's not my choice of colors, but that's what was used. You see a curve there where you've got current stream conditions and potential stream conditions. Some streams out there are so degraded, there's nothing you can do with conservation systems or riparian buffers that's going to have that much of an impact on that water quality in those three goals. It's just not going to happen. There's some that are already in very good shape. You really don't need any more conservation. We have a viable trout industry in Wisconsin, so you don't need much there. But those red ones you see on the slide there, those are the ones we figured were good candidates for this systems riparian buffer approach. So that was purely a value because we fought this one. The environmentalists didn't want to give up on this. I want to go after these down here. Well, you can go after those, but riparian buffers and the upland conservation system isn't going to do much for those. So we finally got them to agree that we're going to focus on those that you see there in the red. This map then came out, and I know you can't read it. It's 1,598 watersheds, the hydrologically complete watersheds, that are ranked 1 through 1,598. And they're ranked on the basis of 3 criteria: the sediment nutrients, the restoration potential, and the trophic index. For those of you not familiar, this is something limnologists use. It's an ordinal scale that talks about the condition of a lake. If you've got a eutrophic lake, that trophic index is pretty high, because lakes, like a lot of aquatic systems, respond to nutrients in a curvilinear fashion. What happens is that it starts getting some macrophytes, algae, weeds, this kind of stuff. And then once it reaches a certain point, that lake crashes. It quickly overcomes. And again, that's part of what we're interested in. So the WBI output, that map, the list 1 through 1598, we produced a report and delivered it to our DNR. We gave, back to the efficiency effectiveness argument, we gave them a list of where any scarce resources, whether it's $1 or whether it's $10 million, would have the greatest impact. What the Aggies bought in, and when I say Aggies, the corn growers, the Farm Bureau, and others, is that we recognize buffers are not needed everywhere. We had a number of models we were running where you come down a slope, that's a little too steep, say a 7-8% slope, you come down, and then it actually goes up next to the stream, and there, you know, the water would run lateral to the stream. You don't need a buffer there. That's not going to do anything. You need a buffer either farther or down gradient or whatever. But the Aggies like the idea that we're not going to put buffers everywhere. We're going to put buffers where they have the greatest impact. And they have to be supported by that conservation system, the contributing area. Some of you may know John Norman, a soil scientist. He's since retired. He had something called PALMS, Precision Agricultural Landscape Management System. And PALMS was actually a 3D model of what happens on a field, relative to water, nutrient infiltration, those type of things. And John was a real strong supporter of this notion right here, that buffers were installed, have to have conservation in that upland area. So WBI science was developed to address a critical policy issue, a controversial policy issue. And while it's a good example of citizen science, I made a mistake. I goofed. I didn't involve the decision makers right from the beginning. And you see that up there. What I should have done was gone to the legislature. We have 2 houses in Wisconsin. And the head of the ag committees in both legislative committee asked them to assign a staffer that would come to all these meetings that went on for 3 or 4 years and have them participate in the process. So we get a buy-in from the policymaker. I mean, there's no way you can ask a legislature to sit down for a once-a-month meeting for 4 years. It's not going to happen. But you can get staffers. And so my mistake was not doing that. And I think what it really demonstrated is I could bring the environmental groups and the agricultural groups to the same table and come up with a conclusion that they both supported. Science was able to do that. Let me move on to the second theme. The tail wags the dog. I quote out of my, when the hell was it? 2006 article about the concept of disproportionality. Limpert, by the way, for those of you who really want to follow up on this, that's a publication in Bioscience. If you look up Limpert in Bioscience 2001, you'll get it. And all Limpert did was, he and his colleagues, was show that if you look at any science, science deals with log normal distributions. That's the role of science. We deal with log normal distributions. And so what I pointed out in this article is when you have a log normal distribution, the biophysical, interacting with a log normal distribution, the social, you're going to get one hell of a mess. That's disproportionality. There's a graphic of it. First off, please note that I'm challenging, I think you've all read Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. I think Hardin, who borrowed it from to be 18th century philosopher, English philosopher, has it all wrong. Because Hardin, in effect, talks about a pasture surrounded, that's commons, surrounded by a bunch of people that are raising cattle or whatever it may be, and it's in each owner's interest to add more and more cattle to take advantage of that common. Well, Garrett Hardin never walked a pasture. Any of you gone on a pasture walk knows that pastures vary dramatically. You can go into one part of a pasture and you have a very lush vegetation. You can go in another part of that same pasture, maybe on a slope, it's eroded, there's hardly any vegetation at all, and the soil structure is shot. It's not there. There's no tilt. There's nothing there. So even if you were to try and plant some sort of seed there, you're not going to get much of a response. So there's highly variability. I think the best example of that, there's those of you who know anything about intensive rotational grazing, there's another variation of that now called mob grazing, where you use a very small paddock and you let the animals in there for just a matter of hours, and then they're moved on to another paddock. So they come in, nice lush growth, bang, they hammer that growth, and then they're moved out. Even in that situation, I see variation in the vegetative cover. So there's nothing uniform biophysically about a pasture. Look at the human behavior, and I'll explain that in a second. Some humans are going to be the ones that are going to put twice as many cattle out there as the neighbors. Others may not put any out there. So there's high variability. Now what this is showing, and it's really important here, is we can classify the environment, the biophysical, by resilience to vulnerability. That's a fairly easy classification. Pick whatever one you want. You can come up with some measure of resilience and some measure of it being a well-buffered system. You can do the same with behavior, but what's different about behavior, appropriate versus inappropriate, and this is the one my social science colleagues have trouble with, is that, whoops, where am I? Got to go forward. What happens is that the biophysical setting determines the appropriateness of the behavior. Rather than throwing all farmers in a sample and treating them essentially the same and say, why don't you adopt? Is it not economically rational or whatever? It depends on the setting. Let me give you an example. Nice Tama silt loam. I'm out there chisel plowing it, flat and black. All of a sudden I come to an 8% slope above a Class A trout stream. That perfectly appropriate behavior up here, that chisel plow on that silt loam soil, now once I go over that slope, suddenly becomes very inappropriate. So it's not the practice, it's not the farmer, it's where the farmer engages in that practice that determines how appropriate it is. And that's a critical element to understand this, because if you've got a resilient system and appropriate behavior, you have very little, close to zero environmental impact. If you have a very inappropriate behavior in that small portion of the landscape that's highly vulnerable, you have a significant impact on that environment. So it's a log normal distribution. Anybody ever read this book? It's a very good. It's a difficult book to get through, but it's got an important lesson. The Black Swan. I hope you all go out and check the library and check it out now. But what it is it's saying that, look, if you look at the problems we deal with, they're the outliers. They're not the norm, the median, the mode. They're the outliers. And rather than thinking of a Gaussian distribution, what we really should be thinking of is power laws and fractal geometry in order to address these outliers, not normal distributions. And yet again, many of my social science colleagues, and I was guilty of this for many years, use statistics based on assumptions of a normal distribution. And what happens is we end up explaining 15% of the variance. Can't figure out why. So there, I'm saying it right there. They're looking for the magic button. Is it tenure, whether you own the land? Is it your age? Is it education? What is it that explains conservation behavior? Well, what I'm saying is it really doesn't matter. It's where conservation behavior is needed. There I want to find out what about that landowner. And I'll give you an example of that in just a second. We know equivalent behaviors do not have equivalent outcomes. It depends. And so recognition of that emerged through precision ag. Again, Fran Pierce, I mentioned, Pierre Robert up at Minnesota. Oh, there were a number of people that were involved in the early days of precision ag. Fran invited us over to the Kellogg Biological Station. I was the token social scientist that got to go. And it was fascinating to listen to this because grid sampling just coming on. Yield monitors were just being developed and perfected. They were still a little rough around the edges. And the agronomists, the agronomists were so excited about this because we did grid sampling. And look at the the variation in the nutrients. If we go out there and we apply variable rate nutrients where there's low and not apply where it's high, we should be able to standardize, normalize the yields. That was the hypothesis in year 1. Year 2, well, first they all went back and they tried it. Year 2, they came back, and lo and behold, there were some very frustrated people there because there was still as much variation in yield as there was before they did the grid sampling and the variable rate. And so we begin to ask why. Why is that occurring? And precision ag really offered some insights to that. You got to recognize that if you pick up 100 meters on any landscape, there's as much variation in that 100 meters as you'll find within a meter. There's a lot of variation out there. And we're never going to be able to control all that variation. It's which variation has to be managed. And so as we look at precision agriculture, that's kind of reinforcing the conservation message I'm saying relative to disproportionality. There's a lot of farmers out there that are farming helter-skelter. I don't care. I want to find out the farmers that are farming helter-skelter on those vulnerable sites, because that's where I can make a difference. That's where science can make a difference. Here's some examples. This is some work I did on the western side of Lake Mendota. Those of you who know anything about Madison knows that Lake Mendota is in eutrophic, not really bad, but it's eutrophic. And this is one of the watersheds, sub-watersheds that drain into it. And after listening to these, my colleagues working in precision ag, I figured I can grid sample. So I went out and I grid sampled all these farms, 19 farms. And I began to look at and try and understand what was going on out there. And you see some of the numbers. But what isn't showing up there is some interesting that observation taught me. For example, let me give you one example. I used to wonder why I couldn't get graduate students, and then I asked someone and they told me why. I bought several hundred of these restaurant pans, these aluminum pans that you see in restaurant serving warming tables. I bought several hundred of these and laid them out in a very precise pattern. And then we had this Night Coon side slinger manure spreader that was calibrated, it had a load cell in it, and we ran it by and spread both liquid, and then we emptied them out, measured, emptied them out, and then did it with solids to find out that distribution pattern. My colleague in ag engineering had a ISCO sampler down this ditch between where the manure storage was and the fields out here. And the idea was, we're getting readings there that doesn't make sense. So if we find out how he's distributing it, maybe we can figure it out. So I'm out there on the farm one day and I'm watching him. He pumps in liquid manure. He goes down and he's got these heavy timbers that he's going to use to cross the ditch to go out in the field. He goes down on that bridge across the ditch and sploosh. This big wave of manure, liquid manure, comes out and lands right in the ditch about 30 yards up gradient from my colleague's ISCO sampler. Needless to say, we had to get him to move the sampler elsewhere. The other thing we found out when we were out there working with those farms is another sploosh factor I found with a side slinger. You don't use those here in Iowa, do you? You pretty much inject all the hog manure? Yeah. Well, a side slinger, you know, there's the old box spreader that has the beater bar in the back. Some of the old timers recognize what that is. You get out in the field, you engage the PTO, and it starts throwing manure helter-skelter across the field and back you. A side slinger, it's actually on the side. You raise the gate when you engage the PTO, and it sends this sheet of manure out. And so what we thought was, okay, we've got it calibrated. We know what's going on. We've done grid sampling on the farm. We're going to watch him now. He goes out the farm, over the bridge, this kind of stuff, gets to the edge of the field where another ditch runs by, opens the gate, and in that time between opening the gate and the PTO engaging, we get a sluice factor. All kinds of liquid manure falls out on the edge of the field right next to the stream. Now, there's another example of how this farmer may be perfect once they get out in the field in terms of the amount of nutrients they're applying, but that one mishap on the edge of the field is causing the problems that ultimately run down gradient. And so working with those 19 farms and trying to find out what was going on, I put those up just so you can see the index. I developed a working hypothesis. And this is the argument that environmental implications of a behavior depends on the biophysical setting where it occurs. Kind of straightforward, fairly easy to test. Therefore, if I can count for both the behavior and the setting, I should be able to address environmental impacts. I got a large USDA grant to basically explore that hypothesis. Those are two of the watersheds that came out of the WBI. They're a paired watershed. Very similar in size, very similar in farm systems, the type of crops, how much is in cropland, how much is in woodlot, that kind of stuff. We matched them real close. We worked in the Pleasant Valley, which is where we did the implementation in a bit, and the Ridgeway was our control watershed. Now, I know others have done this. For example, Mulla up at Minnesota did something similar to this, but he worked with all the farmers. Now, I'm going to show you a different way to approach that. Here's the time frame of that project. We went out and we took poor Katie Songer, one of my graduate students, out there sampling, pea sampling, all these fields out there. And then we ran Russell 2 and that, and you know, we gave the sample results back to the farmer. That was our entree. We'll give them to you or we'll give them to your agronomist, co-op agronomist or whatever it may be. You get them back, we'll give it to you. And we're not sharing them with anybody else, just you'll get them back. So we got on all the farms, did the samples, calculated something called a P index. I think you've got something similar to that down here. Yeah, P index, Russell 2, you know, this was a number of years ago, Russell 2, and we begin to interact with land users. The stream monitoring, USGS came in and set up the samplers on both watersheds. And I'm trying to remember, was it 3 or 4 years of baseline, where we didn't do anything in the watershed until we had a good baseline across the years in terms of what was going on. And then we started working with the landowners. Which landowners? Now, this isn't my choice of colors. The outlet's down here. But what you're looking for are the blue, which has a PI very high, or that, what would you call that, a magenta, a purple, dark purple. Those are the areas where we had very high PIs and they're close to delivery to the stream water body. The bottom line is there were 62 producers in that watershed. We only had to work with 10 of them. So we narrowed it down. Now we're focusing. We use the biophysical to determine which farmers we have to work with. The first step was going out, and this was fun, talking to the farmer, saying, we want to know what's happening on this field. Why are you doing it? And you know what came through again and again and again? Every one of those farmers had a good agronomic or economic rationale on why they're doing what they're doing. They weren't what you call them, bad actor, I think was the term at one time. They're not bad actors. They had a good reason to do what they're doing. And so what we had to do was engage in a discussion with them to try and figure out, no field office tech guide. I'm sorry if any of our NRCS colleagues are online. No field office tech guide. I'm not going to go up to them and say, you have to adopt this. You know, I'm from the government here, we're going to fix it, that type of thing. We talk to them to try and find out. We're going to get the farmers involved in problem solving. I'm going to give you some examples of that. You know quite well here in Iowa what is feed corn or cash grain corn or whatever. In Wisconsin, we've got another type of corn. Corn that you grow and still green. It hasn't dried down, become desiccated or anything. And they go out and they chop it. And they feed that. If you ever drive through Wisconsin or some other dairy and you see these long white tubes out, often that silage corn makes up an important part of that. The thing is when you got field corn or seed corn and you go out and harvest that, the combine blows that residue out back. It's fairly easy with corn to get a 30% cover in order to protect the soil. With silage corn, it all comes off. There is nothing there to protect the soil anymore. So any rain or anything, it's going to run off. And what we did in working with the producer in that case was simply shift the physical location of the rotation. We put the seed corn down closer to the stream bank and moved the silage corn much farther up into the landscape. So when they took that silage corn off, it had a full landscape to run through before it got down to the stream. Second example there, incorporate perennial grasses and alfalfa. Those of you who know anything about Wisconsin know that we have taught farmers probably for 40 years that alfalfa is the hay of choice. You grow alfalfa, you feed alfalfa to your dairy cows. Trouble is first year alfalfa, you get a nice lush spread. Second year alfalfa, you've gone through a winter kill. So that spread now is much sparser. Farmers, of course, it's expensive to grow alfalfa. Your rotation, it's a legume, so there's a nitrogen, so they're going to bring corn in. A lot of farmers try and push it to 3 years. By the time you get to 3 years, that's a pretty thin stand. So what we suggested was, what if we mix some grasses in with that alfalfa when you plant it, perennial grasses, so that we get that protection? Well, I don't know, the farmer said. What's the nutrient characteristics of those grasses? Back to the university we went, to dairy science, and we tried to find out what the nutrient characteristics and which grasses they would recommend. So we came back out and we said, we've got these grasses, the dairy scientists say, have all the nutrients or close to the nutrients that the alfalfa would, and especially if you think that was a sparse stand like that, you're not going to have much. So it's clearly going to exceed what you're getting off a third-year stand. You know what the farmer said at that point? What if my cows don't like the taste of it? We never thought of that. This is what happens when you listen to farmers, when you talk to them and try and understand what's occurring. Well, my cows like it. So we had to set up a test plot where we grew some of that and fed it to the cows to see if the cow would like it. Indeed, the cows liked it. Fence cattle crossing, you know what that is. In the past, he would just let cattle out of the barn. He'd want them to go up over the hill to the field up there and let them graze up there. And of course, the cattle would have to stop in the stream, take a drink or two. What would be the technical term? You get 100% delivery ratio of anything that comes out of the cow into that stream. The cow would pee and poop in the stream. So it was a real problem. And so we put a fenced, nice rock base to the stream, and the cows then went across up into the stream. Stream bank stabilization. There were a few spots on there where you had a lot of legacy phosphorus that were built up in the stream banks, and each time you got a pretty good rain, that phosphorus would wash out. So we had to engage in stream bank stabilization. The last one was, and this is a term I picked up from working in Iowa State, we would hold annual pork chop dinners. We would invite those 10 farmers and their neighbors to a local restaurant, and we would pick up the tab, not alcohol, of course, but there was a cash bar there if they wanted that. And we would pick up, and it wouldn't be the type of meeting where the scientists get up there and lecture to them. We would largely listen. We would circulate. We would find out what their concerns and issues were, what was happening, how's this working out. So it was a way to get the farmers to try and take ownership of that project and the practices they installed. Did it work? 50% reduction in TP across the life of the project. You know, what was at the beginning versus at the end. And of course, comparison to the control watershed, a significant difference. So we got a very good result from that project by focusing on 10 farmers. Because the argument is, when you say disproportionality, the argument always comes up, we don't have enough staff to go out and work, to either do the biophysical assessment or to work one-on-one with the farmers. Well, if you only have to work with 1 out of 6 farmers, suddenly you do have enough staff. And what you're working with them with is trying to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. So back to the title of my presentation, the rearview mirror. I recognize nitrogen, a big issue here in Iowa. I was actually involved with the Raccoon River project many, many moons ago. Is much more dynamic than phosphorus. But I think a lot of the same processes and relations that I spelled out in this presentation is going to apply to that as well. You treat the farmer as an equal, You bring all the parties to the table to figure out where you're going to go and how you're going to do it. It has to be interdisciplinary. It has to be interdisciplinary because you never know what's going to get thrown at you when you work with farmers and you're listening to farmers. You're not lecturing to farmers, you're listening to farmers. They have good questions. You have to be able to respond to those good questions, and that might come from a discipline other than your own. The challenge is learn to listen to the few who need to change current management practices. That's a hard one. Again, I've been working in this area for over 30 years. And for 30 years, we've used a shotgun approach to conservation, any sort of resource management. First come, first served, whatever you want to call it. We take them all in, and whoever comes through the door are the ones we're going to work with. I had a district conservationist in Missouri. I was young in my career, went down there for a meeting. And I asked that DC, this is after when we were drinking a beer, I asked that DC, do you know where the problems are in your county? Which farmers are causing the problem? Sure I do. Well, do you work with them? No. Well, why not? Well, look, here's the list of my cooperators. I can work through so many each year. And by the time I work through that full list, it's time to go back and start at the beginning. And my supervisor loves it. I'm talking with a lot of farmers. I'm getting a lot of conservation on the ground. I'm winning. Wasn't solving any problems, but he's winning. That's the kind of system you're working in. That's the kind of system you have to overcome. The outcome is more important than following externally imposed standards. That's my code word for saying field office tech guy. You don't go out there and throw the field office tech. You know what the field office tech guide is? The NRCS, the agency responsible for resource management, has a guide that's standardized for each county in the United States, all 3,000 some counties. And it's called the Field Office Technical Guide. If you want to install a terrace in western Iowa, the specifications for, let's say, a broadback terrace in western Iowa, it's different than what you're going to get over in Pima County. It varies by the county, but it's a standard approach to these practices. And what I'm saying is throw that out. I know that's harassing the conservation community, but throw it out because you haven't listened to the farmer yet. Find out what the farmer needs to change that behavior. So that outcome is more important. Wrapping up here, I hope I instilled a sense of optimism as you approach a very challenging issue of nutrient management. It's a tough one because, like I say, it's much more dynamic than simple phosphorus, either soluble or particulate. You know, you've got infiltration. I won't go into it. You know it better than I do. It's very challenging, but you can do it if you just follow some patterns. Now, what I used to tell all my graduate students after their final defense was that last line up there. Okay, hopefully I've taught you something. Now go forth and do good. So, thank you, and I'm open to questions. I won't bite your head off, promise. Hi.
So you prepared Watershed Study. You mentioned that you took about 6 years of baseline data and ran models, and then came up with the 10 producers and the treatment watershed.
Right.
To talk to. Do you envision that process would become more automated? You know, the thought of going out
Yeah.
you don't have 4 years.
Yeah, you don't. No, this was a template. We were trying to prove a hypothesis, find supporting evidence for a hypothesis. I would think that you could probably really pare that down, but I wouldn't. You're going to have to talk to a hydrologist, someone that understands that system. How much baseline do they need before they can say there's a change? That may be a couple years, it may be 3 years. That's a question they have to answer, and that's expensive. That's expensive. But remember what you're going for. Back to that effectiveness and efficiency. You want to prove that you can improve water quality in a cost-effective manner. Now, the monitoring is expensive. But remember, you're only dealing with 1 out of 6 farmers once you do that, once you do the analysis. So it is more cost-effective that way. But ask someone from the USGS that. If they would be able to answer that. I can't answer that. This is the advice we got from our USGS colleagues. Other questions?
I'm a real sociologist here at the museum, and I pulled some of the Wisconsin Cluster Initiative work as being some of the gold standard work that's been done in terms of social science, biophysical, melding the two together. But it's incredibly resource intensive, and it's something that I've strived and dreamt about doing in my career, but I'm the only rural sociologist really at Iowa State University that focuses on natural resources and agricultural issues. And so I'm just trying to get smaller stuff done, and it piles up, and I can't do the gold standard. Do you have any advice on how to deal with that?
Well,
I end up doing like the
yeah. You don't have to do the entire state of Iowa. I mean, I know you've got a lot of data on where nitrate nitrogen is an issue, or maybe phosphorus is an issue, maybe pesticides an issue. You know where some watersheds are that are like that. The same analytical type techniques that I talked about can be applied to a small watershed, 20 square miles in our case, but whatever in your case, as it is to the entire state. So start small. Start small and work up. Because again, if you can prove that you can accomplish that effectiveness and efficiency, then that opens up the expansion if you involve the policymakers. That was my problem. Yes, Ann.
So a lot of what you're talking about seems to me is really about the importance of targeting and supports that. And you talked about the challenges with that politically in the beginning. Could you speak to, have you seen changes in acceptance of targeting or appreciation of it through the years with different agencies and conservation districts?
No, it's an easy question. No. No. Targeting is still, it's still a shotgun. When they say targeting, they may target a county, or they may target a hydrologic unit, one of those 8-digit HUCs. They may target that. And there's no way you can really get to the social, let alone the biophysical variation within that large of a unit. I think you're going to have to, as I said earlier, I think you're going to have to pick out a fairly small area to prove the concept. And once you prove the concept that targeting does work, and if you pick a problem, a real significant problem, I mean, in Wisconsin, it's easy. We got a very important trout fishery, and we got some very vocal trout organizations that they love nothing better than us become involved and try and protect that resource. You know, of course, climate change now is really the curveball. But then again, there's another biophysical element that you could bring into your modeling. Targeting has not worked, but I think it has the potential to work, is the short answer.
Any questions on this side of the room?
All right, you can pick up the test on the way out.
Yeah.
We'll find out how well you listened.
All right, let's thank Pete again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I know he wants to get on the road back to Wisconsin, but I imagine he'll stay around a few minutes if folks have individual questions. So thanks a lot. And just as a reminder, we will continue to meet the 4th Wednesday of the month, same time, same place, the next 3 months. Next month, we have Dr. Dan Janes that has spent his career in monitoring water quality and has done a lot of work specifically in Iowa at a range of scales. And so he'll talk about some of the water quality monitoring he's been involved with, and how that's helped in kind of informing some of the practices that we're working to implement. So thanks everybody for coming, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
There's the answer to your question next month. Shut this off now.